Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Smooth Nzewi. I'm the curator of African Arts here. On behalf of Dr. Michael Taylor and my colleagues at the Hood, I want to welcome you to the Hood. For some time now, the museum has been without a curator of African arts. And my principal concern since I arrived at Dartmouth in about a year and a half ago is to sort of revive interest in African art. And we have a very good collection of African art at the Hood. So thank you for coming. Before introducing our speaker, I want to quickly say a special thank you to our friends at the Dickey Center and the African American Studies program for co-sponsoring the lecture today. The lecture completes a series of events organized in conjunction with the Art of Weapons on view in the Gottman Gallery, one of our first floor galleries. In addition to addressing African weaponry as aesthetic objects, the exhibition explores social ideas embedded in warriorhood, masculinity, and male beauty in the traditional context in the African world. No person is in a better position to provide deeper illumination on the subject as our speaker, Dr. Kasfir, whose book, African Art and the Colonial Encounter, examined the impact of colonialism on warriorhood and transformed aesthetic practices surrounding it among the Samburu people of the North Rift Valley of Kenya and Idoma people of the Lower Benue Valley in Nigeria, two places she has done substantial field work. So it gives me immense pleasure to introduce Dr. Sidney Kasfir, Professor Emerita of Art History at Emory University and a leading scholar of African art. Dr. Kasfir holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Physics and Mathematics from Simmons College, an MA in Art History from Harvard, and a PhD in African Art from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. She has taught in several institutions, including at Dartmouth in the 1970s and 80s. Before her retirement at Emory University in 2012, she trained several graduate students who are leading scholars in the field. I was fortunate to be one of her last two PhD students. So Kasfir's academic achievements and scholarship are far-reaching with footprints in art history, curatorial practice, visual cultures, and anthropology. She has written extensively and published numerous articles, essays, criticisms, and books on topical issues and themes, such as historiography, canon formation, authenticity, masking system, sacred kingship, blacksmithing, museum classificatory system, and display of African art. Her scholarship has had a tremendous impact on African art and African studies, at least in the last 30 years. What makes her a very compelling scholar is not only because she was my academic advisor, of course that's important, but how she combines deep knowledge of historical African art, that is to say, long-standing art traditions and practices, and a pioneering role as one of the few art historians who began to write about modern and contemporary African art when it was still viewed with suspicion in academia. Her book, Contemporary African Art, which maps African art in the 20th century, is a required text in most colleges. Her more recent book, African Art and Agents in the Workshop, a co-edited volume, analyzes the transformation of the art workshop tradition in Africa by looking at several examples, the long-standing models, the modern and contemporary equivalents, and situating them within a set of frames as economic institutions, social spaces of learning and interaction, and also how workshop practice in a general sense reveals the tension between individual autonomy, authority, and innovations. On the curatorial front, which incidentally began her career into the African art world in the early 70s in Uganda, her more recent intervention is the co-curated, impressive, and ground-shifting international exhibition, Central Nigeria Unmasked, Arts of the Benue River Valley in 2011, at UCLA's Fowler Museum, Smithsonian's National Museum of African Art, Stanford University's Cantor Center, and Musée de Quai Branly in Paris. The exhibition was accompanied by an equally impressive tome, a 606-page scholarly publication. It's this thick. Kasfir's current project focuses on early British colonial collecting in eastern Nigeria in connection with the mandate for indirect rule by looking at collections at Oxford's Pitt Rivers Museum and the British London, respectively. Her lecture today will trace the meaning of the spear in the definition of masculinity and the gradual change from spears to gun in the North River Valley of Kenya as a result of the flow of illegal weapons out of neighboring Somalia and South Sudan. Please join me in giving Professor Kasfir a rousing welcome.
Thank you so much. Go back to the beginning here. I just to let you know, why should this white-haired grandmother know something about African masculinity? I've been doing field work in Samburu now since 1991. I've been there every year for between 6 weeks and 6 months, and in the same place. And so it's with the same family, the same age set, the same everything. So that's my explanation, if I have one. That I know many of the people you see in the photographs are my personal friends and relatives. So that only takes you so far, of course. Yes, I am not a warrior. So don't claim to be. Who are the Samburu? Because they are the focus here. The Samburu are Maasai-speaking pastoralists who herd cattle, sheep, goats, these are herded together, and camels. In 3 different landscapes, the remote mountain fastnesses, the temperate highlands, and the hot, dry lowlands of the Great Rift Valley corridor, which runs all the way down from the Red Sea through to, Mozambique? Something like that, runs right down through Eastern Africa. And it's a hot, dry valley on the valley floor and with mountains lining it on both sides. It's a huge fault in the earth which can be seen from outer space. It's that big. And of course, if you don't know Africa, we're over here. We're over here. And that is Lake Turkana, that finger-like projection, and we're just south of it, just south of that finger in Kenya, northern Kenya. The Great Rift Valley and its surrounding ranges and Lake Turkana are the landscape in which all of these things, these practices, social practices, and aesthetic practices take place. Their social relations, the Samburu's social relations, are structured and mediated by a 4-part age grade system, in which the second part is warriorhood. Now, the age grades are very simple. They're number 1, uncircumcised boy; number 2, circumcised warrior; number 3, junior elder, young, which is the young married man; and number 4, senior elder, who is the person who runs things in the community. So the warriors then are the second part of this 4-part age grade system, and this is just a depiction of the area itself. Here's Lake Turkana, and then down here, almost dripping off it at the bottom, is the Samburu area. However, they live in a bigger region even than this. This area, Mount Kulal, is also part of the Samburu region. And down here, which is where the story I'm about to tell you takes place, this is called Laikipia. And white settlers were allowed to live here and farm by the British colonial government, and that's where the trouble began. And the Samburu, in fact, live south nowadays. They live south of this yellow line in Laikipia as well as here. So they're very spread out. I think within the country, they have the lowest, or not just they, but the pastoralists here in the north have the lowest population density. They're 3 people per square kilometer. That's pretty low. That's definitely pretty low. Okay. So this on the left is what I mean by the second stage in the age grade system. This is warrior. The term for warrior in Kenya is a Moran, which is an anglicized word coming from the Maasai word, Urmaran. And I'll just call them interchangeably warrior or Moran. This person on the right that he's looking at is a boy who is has just been circumcised, and he's in that liminal, neither here nor there stage. Hasn't yet been ceremonially made a warrior, but he's about to become. So notice the weaponry. You can see 2 of the 3 kinds of weapons that all of these Samburu Moran carry. The twin spears, and you see those actually, you'll see ones just like those in the exhibition upstairs. A sword, a short sword, and then the third weapon, which is usually tucked under the arm, is a wooden club called a rungu. And the spear has a very small blade, but it didn't always. I'm going to tell you why it changed and how it changed, so that you can see how socially embedded the aesthetics of this are. The stage of life that we call Moranhood or warriorhood, is not only ritually marked, but sharply focused on body arts and weaponry. And here again, the body arts, I don't know how well you can see this, but he's got red ochre cosmetic on his face and all over his hair, and also down his chest in a V shape in the front and in the back. And he is wearing ivory earplugs and beadwork in his hair and on his neck and on his arms. And so all of those things together are part of the warrior's presentation of himself. They're admired by their girlfriends, they're indulged by their mothers, and at the same time they exist in a state of tension and rivalry with both the warriors of other Samburu sections with whom they compete and with the older age sets of men who are their fathers and grandfathers who have left warrior status and who are the people who own cattle, who own wives, who own children, and who basically are in charge of the social system. Oh, and yeah, those were pictures taken from that picture on the left was taken from a coffee table book. Here's my own version. These are taken right outside my house last year, and it's a couple of warriors. This guy is called Umunai, and this one is called Iltaparua, and they are celebrating one of their many rites of passage. Here they are from the back, and you can see that growing your hair is a major part of your virility, sign of your virility as a warrior. To illustrate the close relation between weaponry and the idea of virility or end of bravery, I begin with something that happened called the Samburu Spear Ban in 1934, which has been reported in British colonial documents, where I read about it first, and their interpretation by historians and anthropologists. Later, I went around and interviewed the few still alive members of that age set of warriors who were involved in the Spear Band. And those men are no longer alive. That was around 1990, 91, 92 when I first went there, when they were in their 80s. The events that precipitated this Spear Band took place in 1931 when a group of Samburu warriors were implicated in a homicide. What followed was a long investigation by the British in which the accused killers were eventually allowed to go free for lack of enough evidence. But a group punishment instead was meted out on them, which was the Spear Band. There was a kind of colonial ambivalence concerning Samburu warriorhood, which on the one hand romanticized the Ma-speaking pastoralists as quote, sort of disappearing signs of an aristocratic Africa, and on the other hand saw what the British called spear blooding as unruly and unacceptable adolescent behavior, which needed to be shut down, kind of like what happens periodically at Dartmouth. But gets into the New York Times. The bare facts are these. In 1931, a group of Samburu warriors speared a lone white man named T.L. Powys, who had come on his pony to inspect a borehole at a place the Samburu called the Pingwan on the Laikipia Plateau north of Mount Kenya. And that was just south of that yellow area that I showed you on the map a moment ago. And this was where white settler farms really encroached on Samburu grazing fields to the north. They left the body after killing him. They left the body, which was later eaten by lions, but they took the head as a trophy. The next day, a search party found remnants of Powys' clothes, 1 foot inside a boot, and a few bones. His death was therefore attributed to lions, but soon rumors began to circulate that something else had happened besides. An exporter of the King's African Rifles testified to the British that he had heard a group of Moran singing of their exploit at a dance that, quote, the vultures dropped on the Pingwan to eat one loved by the people of Nairobi, unquote. There ensued a long investigation which ultimately failed to prove definitively who the culprits were. Because the farm's owner, however, was Lady Eleanor Cole, a British aristocrat with connections in very high places, the Powys murder case was taken all the way to Whitehall. In retaliation, the colonial government placed a ban on Samburu warriors carrying spears for more than 20 years. From 1934 to 1956. Warriors responded to this by hiding their spears in the bush, which was, after all, an area of thousands of square miles of semi-desert and montane forest, which the government in faraway Nairobi could not effectively police, thus confining the effectiveness of the ban to the few places where there were police posts. Nonetheless, blacksmiths, the makers of those spears, had to radically change their practice, their spear-making practice, which had long-range repercussions for the design of the Samburu spear and of their practice, their style of warfare. Now, in this next section, I'd like to look at the spears themselves before and after the 22-year spear ban was imposed and how they underwent thorough changes in design which affected everything. First, the relevant history. The Samburu are the northernmost branch of the Maasai, who prior to the 1880s moved their herds through the entire Rift Valley of what is now Kenya. This is a group of Maasai warriors in 1900 guarding the brand new Uganda Railway, which was just in the process of being built. from the coast up all the way through Kenya to Uganda. Look at their spears, and I think you can see with this one, he's holding it at such an angle, you can see quite clearly what the design is. It's a large blade, tapered toward the top, and large and long. This type of spear was also used by the neighboring Kikuyu. Let me just first show you one of my pictures of Maasai carrying it just a few years ago. This was in Tanzania, just over the border from Kenya, and you can see that they are carrying still very long type blade. And back in those days, in 1900, as you saw in the previous picture, the Kikuyu also carried the same type of spear. And you can see it pretty clearly right here in this sketch. That is an illustration from a book published close to 1900, I think about 1914. And over here, it's not quite so clear, but it is basically the same type of what's called a thrusting spear. It's not a throwing spear. It's a thrusting spear. It's too heavy to throw any great distance, and so it's useful for thrusting in close combat or in encounters with dangerous animals. But with the 1934 spear ban, the Samburu smiths were forced to move. They had to move their smithies to the margins of Samburu grazing lands, where they could stay active by making spears for neighboring pastoralists, especially the Turkana, who had few blacksmiths of their own. This again is an illustration from a book published in the 1880s. And it shows Turkana warriors racing down a hill with their spears and their shields. And you can see that these are very different. They're very small, what's called a leaf blade, leaf-shaped blade on a long spear. And they're very lightweight in comparison. And they're for throwing, not for thrusting. So when the spear ban, the smiths then moved, the Samburu smiths, in order to stay in business, to keep making spears, moved then close to the edges of where Samburu and Turkana come together, and began making these small spears, small spear blades for the Turkana. When the spear ban ended, the new Samburu warrior age set, called the Ukashili, adopted this twin spear called Lamau. Why two? One to throw and one to keep for close fighting. As one of the Ukashili elders explained to me, if you have only one spear and you throw it and miss, you are dead, or at least helpless. This is a map in German, and it's old, but it will at least show you where it is that I'm talking about in Kenya. So the main reason then, I think, for the divergence, for the change in Samburu spears came about because of the fact that they were now being made for the Turkana as well as for the Samburu. But another thing happened, and here is where it's totally essential that you understand the history as well as the cultural geography for it to make sense. The British, when they colonized Kenya, first used the Maasai as allies against farming people. I mean, the Maasai were warriors. They didn't care. Because what the British did was to capture the livestock, burn the villages, capture the livestock. That was their stock in trade. And they would give a lot of the livestock to the Maasai for helping them to do this. So the Maasai were on good terms with the British. The British then decided that they wanted to colonize, they wanted to settle white settlers who had come, who were immigrating there, they wanted to settle them in the Rift Valley where they could farm, where there was excellent farmland available in the southern part of the Rift Valley, not up north where the Samburu live. So they talked the Maasai into signing a treaty with them at first in 1904, which would allow the British to start moving the Maasai around and move them a little further south from where they were. And then in 1911, they forcibly removed them from Laikipia to an area south of the Athi River. And let me just show you where I mean so you can get a sense of how far they moved them. The Maasai were in the whole Rift Valley, like this. They were in the whole Rift Valley. And then the British maneuvered them out of this area that they wanted, that the British wanted to use for white farms, for European farms. And they forced them out of the area that I'm calling Laikipia in order to not have to share that land with them. And they did this in a very devious way. They made the British Foreign Office think that the Maasai were, quote, willing and anxious to move, unquote, which was a lie. This was very far from the truth. But there were a series of maneuvers by 3 successive colonial governors. Sir Charles Eliot, Sir Donald Stewart, and Sir Percy Gerard all conspired in various ways with their senior officers to make it appear to the British Foreign Office back in London that the Maasai really wanted to move. The government, though, in fact, was ruthless. They confiscated their spears and shields and burned them in order to prevent opposition to the relocation. And they relocated them south of Nairobi, way down here in this area, close to what was to become the border with Tanzania. Okay, so south of what's called the Athi River, and Nairobi is there. So all of this area where the Maasai used to be, they no longer were, but the Samburu was still left up here. So that was 1911, so there was 100 years of separate development. And that was certainly enough time for there to be some cultural divergence between the Samburu and the other Maasai, and one of those things was the spears and shields for fighting. Okay, now, blacksmithing itself. This is a blacksmith homestead, a settlement, or what's called in the Maasai language an nkang, the thorn fence and buildings inside it. And it is up around in the northern area around Lake Nyeri. So it's not as far north as Lake Turkana, but it's getting in that direction. Before the spear bend, then, the Samburu smiths were also smelters of iron. And so smelting and smithing, you may have heard this in the previous lecture, I don't know, from the blacksmith who came and talked earlier in the program. But smiths, in some very complicated African cultures where there was a lot of differentiation in occupation, smiths and smelters were different people. But among people who were very rural, like the pastoralists, it was the same person who both smelted the iron and did the blacksmithing to make the weapons. And what they used, they didn't build furnaces, smelting furnaces. Or rather, the smelting furnaces were pits dug in the ground. And the source of iron were ferruginous sandbeds in streams near the bases of mountains, like Mount Uru. But as they were forced to move by the ban, away from Samburu locations, such as these mountains, Mount Kulal, Mount Marsabit, Mount Uru, into the hot, dry lowlands, they suddenly didn't have the right stuff to make iron. They didn't have that ferruginous sand. And so they began to use scrap metal, which colonialism brought in its wake, along with the imported motor vehicles, trains, and telephone wires. This actually happened all over the continent, so that by the late 1920s, smelting had ceased almost everywhere in Africa. It is one of the most sweeping technological changes in African history, though it's rarely mentioned in books. And this is a blacksmith in that very settlement. Here he is making spears, and his father actually did smelt iron. His father was still alive when I first visited there, and I interviewed him, and he explained in great detail how the smelting was done. This is his mother, and she is operating the bellows. And this is very interesting, too, because you don't usually expect to see women in a smithy because of all kinds of prohibitions that have to do with blood, menstrual blood. And she is an old woman, though, so there's no blood prohibition in her case. There's no question of pollution. A younger woman would not be able to do this, would not be able to be there. A really good Samburu smith, oh, and wait, there's one more of him, yeah, working. A really good Samburu smith is able to make 8 different kinds of spears. From the training spear used originally by little boys, that you see here, to the warrior twin spears, to something called the calf spear, which is carried by elders ceremonially, and it's called that because you used to have to pay 1 calf for it back before people used money for these things. And then most recently, the tourist spear, and this is carried to the coast, to the Swahili coast, where there are beach resorts, by a few enterprising young warriors every year, such as you see here. And these are highly embellished, short spears. They're actually like the little boy's spear in size, but they have been all decorated up. They've got beads on them and goat hair and stuff like that, so that they're fancy looking, and those are sold to Italian tourists primarily. Though I have to say, when we took Dartmouth students, Nelson will remember this, they all wanted a spear. All the male students wanted a spear. And the women students didn't care. But the guys all wanted a spear. But however, they didn't really want the tourist spear. They wanted the real thing that's carried by the warriors that I showed you back a few slides ago, which is a good deal taller than a person. It's very long. The shaft is very long, and so you can't carry that home a suitcase. Okay. I think I'm just going to skip a little bit of this in order to get back to the issue of virility, to draw out the aesthetics of warrior practice, and to understand how the warrior's youthful daring is paired with the visualization of his masculinity through comportment and through dress. The stock explanation of the colonial officers who were assigned to the Northern Frontier District for those acts of spear blooding was tied also to the idea of masculinity. They observed that at dances, there was a good deal of flirtation between the Moran and their young girlfriends, who sang taunting songs, accusing them of cowardice in the face of danger. And this is a picture that I took maybe 10 years ago of a group of warriors at a wedding. They come as a group, and a group of young girls who are uncircumcised girls, and they are therefore not married girls. That's a whole other lecture on girls and women. And they come and they taunt them. It's flirting. It's a flirtation, a way of, you guys are not brave. You're cowards. You're basically cowards. Show us that you're not cowards. So the British tried social engineering in order to stop this spear blooding. They thought that the Moran were being challenged by these girls and therefore went out and blooded their spears. Okay, so the first thing the British did was forbade the giving of beads by warriors to their girlfriends. They also forbade them from holding meat feasts in the forest because they assumed that was the place where the spear bloodings were planned. And most radically, they banned the bachelor Moran from carrying spears for over 20 years. Well, none of those prohibitions were enforceable. Given the vast unpoliceable landscape of the Northern Frontier District, which is what it was called then, the colonial government also failed to acknowledge that there was a larger reason for spear blooding that had nothing to do with dances and girlfriends and bragging rights, but was retaliation by an unwilling colonial subject people against the incursions of white settlers onto traditional Samburu grazing lands. I now move away from the Powys murder to a more detailed examination of the connection between the body arts, the spear, and the stages of transition in achieving a full Samburu manhood. Oh, and these are close-ups from that same dance. And you can see the girls are dancing. Their way of dancing is to flip those necklaces up in the air by arching their back so that you see the necklaces here kind of in motion as they're being flipped up. And this is considered very flirtatious. And similarly, the guys who are growing their hair for the whole 14-year period of Moranhood, if they can, have little pigtail things on the ends of their braids, and they flip those with their heads forward and knock the girls in the face with them. And so that's their kind of way of speaking through dancing, speaking back to these girls who are taunting them. The ritual process is critical for the Samburu in the constructing of masculine identity through a series of ilmugat, or rites of transition, in which the uncircumcised, unsocialized male child becomes a member of an age-set cohort of warriors, and over a 14-year period moves through the different stages of maturation. And here, this is right after, this is actually right before circumcision. They're called Libarta, and their song is called Libarta, and they're called Libartok, those who sing the Libarta song, and they're just about to enter into circumcision. They have a tonsure, their hair is cut in a certain way, they wear a particular type of beads made by their mothers, bead necklace made by their mothers, and those are the beetle wings at the bottom of it, and a black goatskin cape that the mother has also made. And basically the mothers make everything, all of the ritual artifacts that are used. Then the circumcision itself, which is done with a knife, and is completely a male affair. There are no women around. That's the godfather holding the boy's face, and down here is the man who is wielding the circumcision knife. And because it's only done every 14 years, there's a huge age range of boys who are circumcised. It scoops up everybody who hasn't been circumcised in the last 14 years. So there can be a great variation. I mean, this is one group of guys who have all just been circumcised. And you can see that the boy here on the left is maybe 12, 13 years old. And the one on the right looks, I mean, big and muscular. He could be 20. So they are quite varying in age. They, at the end of 1 month, are given a white cloth to wear. Their body is covered with red ochre, and they are given their first spear. And that replaces the bow and arrow, which they carried up until then. The same aesthetic strategies followed in the Ilmugic carry over into everyday dress. The Sambur practice a set of self-representations, the way in which they display themselves, that I call warrior theater. It involves a number of fighting rituals, scrupulous attention to body arts at all times, hair arrangement, ochre, the wearing of beads, feathers, ivory, and a very self-consciously aloof comportment. And I show you that aloofness here. This happens to be a photo shoot for Sports Illustrated's swimsuit issue a few years back, in which some Sports Illustrated editor got the crazy, clever idea of going to a Maasai settlement and photographing the models there. And the Maasai just ignored them. I mean, basically, this was the aloof comportment part of it. Karen Blixen, who wrote about the Maasai, described in the book Out of Africa, described this as, quote, the rigid, passive, insolent bearing of the Moran, unquote. And while his comportment might come across to strangers as arrogant, to the girls and young women that he's hoping to impress, as well as the other warriors, it's seen as quite sophisticated and worldly. It's certainly theatrical. It also serves him well, this lack of display of emotion, serves him well in masking the pain of circumcision, which is his first opportunity to display that persona. He is not expected to even blink an eyelash when he's circumcised. And the only anesthesia is ice cold water thrown on him just before it's done. I can still couch this in the present because the age grade system is still around. They're still fighting and dancing and being seen. There is still ochre. This was just about 3 years ago. These are two warriors painting each other with the design that's going to be worn for a wedding. And this is the groom on the right, best man on the left. The ochre comes from the Aberdare Mountains. It's sold in markets as a powder. Comes out of the ground. And, it's ferruginous. That's why it's red. It's mixed with something which is called kimbo in East Africa, and it would be closest to what we call Crisco here. In the old days, before there were commercial products like that, it was mixed with animal fat to make it a smooth paste. And then the hair. Oh, okay, here's another example. The hair, yes. It takes about 18 hours to do all of these very tiny, thin braids on a warrior's head. And so he does not have it done very often. And it takes a couple of people working for him. This was when I taught this material, both at Dartmouth and at Emory. It was so hard for undergraduates, I think especially males, to wrap their heads around young men who spend that much time on their appearance and at the same time go on cattle raids and are not afraid to walk into the bush for 100 miles with animals looking for water and pasture. I mean, somehow in our way of thinking, those two things don't go together. But in fact, in Africa, they sometimes do go together. And the very fancy, in addition to the ochre and the beads and all of that, there are just ingenious kinds of hair treatments that they come up with. This one is this is a bag. This is a zipper bag used for, I don't know, maybe cosmetics or something like that, which he has cleverly turned into a hat. And that fish-shaped object on the top of his head is cut from a plastic yogurt can, very intricately. And those feathers are from real birds, and those flowers, those are artificial flowers that you can buy at Christmas time in markets, in town markets for decorations. The symbolism of spears themselves is not just something that's important for the Samburu. It's a part of Nilotic pastoralist ideology. It's not unique to them. Evans Pritchard, the great Evans Pritchard, wrote in his book on the Nuer about Nuer warriors and their spears. This is a Nuer warrior. Looks very different from Samburu physically. And his beads are very different, but there is his spear. And there is one in the exhibition, too. And Evans Pritchard says, it's not the acquisition of a weapon, whatever its economic value may have been in the past, nor even its utility, great though that may be, that gives a crucial significance to the gift of a spear at initiation. Its significance is moral, not merely utilitarian. It is not the spear itself which is stressed, but the activities associated with it, war and raiding, dancing and display, and herding. The spear is not just a weapon, but also something which stands for a very complex set of social relations. It is a projection of the self and stands for the self, unquote. I now move to the final point of the presentation, which is really dealing with what has changed. And even though the spear is still a socially marked, even though warriorhood is still a socially marked period of life, the spear has begun to lose ground. It's still symbolically important, but things have changed. This time, it's not British pacification or government control that are responsible, but they're opposite, increasing levels of violence and political chaos in surrounding regions for which the Kenya government has no effective antidote. For the North Rift pastoralists, living as they do in a remote area with few roads and little active policing, national boundaries have always been very permeable ever since they've existed. Therefore, raiding has taken place across those borders for as long as there have been borders there, which has been, since around 1900 or so. So raiding then, it's a blood sport. We called it spear blooding. It's a blood sport. And it's also the staging ground for a lot of what I call warrior theater. And finally, it's a means for the redistribution of wealth, and has been for centuries among the pastoralists of the Northern Rift Valley. So not only has it been an essential part of the economy of pastoralism, but it's also been the measure of successful warriorhood itself. What has changed in the past 25 years has been the introduction of illegal weapons in very large numbers, circulating because of the destabilized political regimes in each of these countries bordering northern Kenya. Beginning with the Somali Shifta fighters in the 1960s who tried to liberate the Northern Frontier District so it could be annexed to Somalia, guns have presented an ever more serious challenge to spear-carrying warriors there. The history of European military incursion in Africa illustrates how crucial a technological edge in weaponry can be in subduing local populations anywhere. Whether the British in late 19th century Hausaland or Asante or Benin or Zululand or the French against the Tuareg, back then it was the Maxim gun, today it's the Kalashnikov. An example of this colonizing challenge in East Africa was the Italian invasion of what was then called Abyssinia and later became Ethiopia, back in 1935. But the Abyssinians fought back, and they captured many of the Italians' rifles. They called themselves the Patriots, and they were an insurgency. And they vowed that they would not cut their hair until the Italians were expelled. The first big influx of illicit arms into the hands of Kenyan pastoralists occurred in 1979, when a large military armory in Moroto, northern Uganda, was broken into, and the guns acquired by the Karamojong, cattle pastoralists who were traditional rivals and relatives of the Turkana across the border, the Uganda-Kenya border. As Turkana themselves seized those weapons in counter raids, and the Pokot and the Samburu acquired them in counter raids against the Turkana, all of them, in all the North Rift cattle raiders armed with guns, came to be known in the 1980s as Ngoroko. More than a decade later, the political collapse of Somalia into warring factions in 1991 created a second easy source of guns for Somali pastoralists making incursions into northern Kenya. Concurrently, there was also the long-standing civil war in the southern Sudan, the third source of illicit guns circulating in the region. One important point of entry for those arms into Kenya has been the border town called Lokichogio, where deserting members of the Southern Sudanese army reputedly sold their weapons. Occasionally, these forays carry overtones of humor at their sheer daring in the face of officialdom. Back in June 2003, the Uganda Army was sent into remote Karamoja district to protect local villages from incessant cattle raids by Karamojong warriors. The warriors responded by breaking into the government boma during the night and stealing the army's own cattle. A study conducted by the Security Research and Information Center in Nairobi found a direct link between cattle rustling and arms trafficking in all the North Rift Valley districts. Why is that a surprise? One of the researchers told the Sunday Standard newspaper, you need not struggle to get arms in the region. They are just like walking sticks. There, the herding stick is a fully loaded AK-47 rifle. The Kenyan government had originally responded to the shift of threat by the creation of what they called a home guard, carefully screened middle-aged pastoralists, i.e. not warriors. This would be one, this man here. Whom they armed with rifles. But in today's climate of arms proliferation, the Home Guard, now officially called the KPR, the Kenya Police Reserve, are inadequate with their small numbers and random weapons, including many non-automatic rifles, such as you see here. Even worse, the study claims that in some districts, members of the KPR actually use their government-issued weapons to participate in cattle raids. The KPR presence, along with the burgeoning number of illegal guns, has created an escalating cycle in which pastoralists without guns feel under strong pressure to acquire them for use in self-defense, thus further ratcheting up the level of endemic violence. Well, where is the spear in all this? It is still the first line of defense against predators, such as hyenas, lions, and leopards, which threaten livestock. It is also the major symbol still of warriorhood in the Ilmugets, in the rituals of transition. And also, however glamorous the gun is, and it definitely has cachet, no question, it is a generic and not a Samburu symbol of masculine prowess. It's carried by one's enemies in an identical shape and form as one's own. And finally, the spear is still preferable for certain types of fighting at close range. So for all these reasons, it's not about to disappear, but at the same time, it's never again going to enjoy the unchallenged superiority it held before the colonial scenario was set in motion a century ago. Finally, since this study is about the aesthetics as well as the artifacts of warriorhood, it is also worth considering how the acquisition of an assault rifle changes the way in which the warrior is visualized. The Moran, with his customary weaponry, spear, rungu, and sword, along with his numerous embellishments, ochre beads, feathers, braided hair, presents himself to the Westerner as a romantic anachronism, detached from the temporal frame of the present, and instead part of a, quote, dying world, which predates and ultimately must succumb to modernity. But a gun changes all that. He is instead thrust forward, beads, ochre, and all, into the postmodern condition, which is quintessentially one of hybridity, which of course this is. In the warrior theater that I've argued is an essential part of Moranhood, this disjuncture between his embodied personal aesthetic and a lethal weapon associated with modern, especially guerrilla warfare, sharply increases the level of theatricality as well as the danger. He's at a mortal risk, but at the same time an artifact of masculinity on display. These raids are only reported in the newspaper or on TV in Kenya if someone prominent is involved. For example, when in December 1996, Turkana rustlers shot down a government helicopter near Baragoi, killing the district commissioner, an MP, and other government officials. But the most daring feats rarely reach the news media, since their staging is very far from Nairobi reporters' beats. They are narrated instead by word of mouth and become part of the grapevine of rumor and gossip and ultimately oral tradition. I should add that the pastoralist rumor mill has shifted into high gear in the last 10 years since cheap cell phones became available. An example of this daring is the oral account told to me of how the protracted Turkana incursions against Samburu and Pokot in 1996-97 finally came to a halt when the Pokot were able to find the Turkana leader's hidden camp and kill him in an ambush. In a piece of grisly but spectacular warrior theater, the triumphant Pokot led the Turkana leader's favorite ox into the Pokot camp, with his rifle tied across the ox's horns, along with his severed head. Narratives such as these confirm that raiding is still a high-stakes performance, where bravery, triumphal revenge, and humiliation are still the currencies which activate warrior aesthetics in Kenya's North Rift, whether in 1900 or a century later. Thank you.
Since we're a little bit out of time, we will entertain a few questions. Maybe two or three.
I'm fine.
Okay. Thank you. Such a brilliant
When you look at some of these historic photos taken by a Western photographer, how much of that is posed to benefit the photographer and not reality?
Well, you know, I showed you quite a few by Wilfred Thesiger, who actually lived a mile from me in Kenya until he died in his 90s. He did pose some of his subjects, definitely. And I mean, you could tell the ones that were posed. The one of the, very close to the beginning of the warrior, standing on one leg, looking at the initiate in his black cape skin coat with his bow and arrows. I mean, that was certainly a pose. I think that was by Nigel Pavitt, who had been an army officer and had Samburu. Like with Thesiger, he had a strong Samburu connection. He wasn't someone who swooped in like the Sports Illustrated people did. He didn't just swoop in and take pictures for a coffee table book. I mean, both of those men, both Thesiger and Pavitt, basically spent their adult lives living with pastoralists, and as photographers, took thousands of pictures. All of Thesiger's pictures and negatives are in the Pitt Rivers Museum now, and I've just spent 2 months there going through all of those, and they are fascinating. But yes, it's right. I mean, Thesiger, for example, he was a British aristocrat. His father was the ambassador. It wasn't called that. It was called something else. But the ambassador to Haile Selassie, so his view was certainly colored by his upbringing. He went to Eton and all of that, but. And we would say it was romantic. For example, he refused to use color film, absolutely, right up until he died, which was in the 90s. He never took a color photograph. And it was partly snobism on his part. He didn't want to be associated with people who do coffee table books or who do tourist postcards. So there's a range of points of view among those who photograph. Some of them are very elitist, and I didn't show you some of the photographs by women photographers of the pastoralists because those are really, some of them are really incredibly overly romanticizing pastoralist life. And there are a couple of women whose names I will not mention, but who have made careers out of photographing the Maasai, for example. And they have become famous in their own right for that. But the pictures that they take they're not exactly posed, but I know from the fact that I had a graduate student who once went on a trip with them, not Smooth, another graduate student, how they got people to pose. And they would, dance around them with money and sort of go boop and put it in the person's wrapper or something like that. They were very coy with money. And so there's a huge range. There's no one answer.
It's not central to the talk, but you've talked a little bit about female circumcision. Has there been quite a lot of pressure to move away from that? I would imagine since circumcision for males is a much different thing.
It is a much different thing. Male circumcision is probably the most important event in a male's life in Samburu. It's more important than marriage, certainly, and it's more important than anything because it's what makes you a member of the culture, fully a member of the culture. They're so disdainful of uncircumcised boys. With girls, it's very different. It's changing. And the change is coming not from pressure from the government, because the government, that's like the British telling the Samburu that they can't give beads to girls. It's not enforceable. And neither was the post-colonial government's insistence that female circumcision had to be stopped. That's not enforceable either. It has to come from inside, and it has begun to do so. I have 5 stepdaughters, and the first 3 were circumcised, and the last 2 were not. So it is changing, but it's changing because girls now go to school. There's now universal primary education, which goes through grade 8, and their teachers are not Samburu women. Their teachers are women from other parts of Kenya. And so the girls get the message that A, the teachers don't approve of it, and B, that some of the other girls who are not Samburu don't either. And once that happens, then things change. But there was no amount of government pressure that was going to change it. It just doesn't work that way.
I was wondering how the introduction of the rifle affected the ritual that surrounds the spear, because I know you said the spear still exists. It's not completely obsolete or phased out. So do they still go through the phases of getting the young boy spear and then going through maturation and certification towards warrior and getting that spear?
Right. You mean it? Well, it starts out as a plaything, just like a bow and arrow. They're playthings. You play with them and learn to use them. And I would say that has a longer shelf life because they're not intended, that is for young kids, they're not intended for any kind of a military purpose. And also kids don't have toys. And you can't play. I've brought a soccer ball several times, and it gets ruined within about a half hour because the thorn trees have these thorns that are 4 inches long, and once you have those thorns on the ground, you can't play soccer. You can't keep a ball. So I think at the younger end, yes. And as far as ceremonies go, yes. It's just that for raiding, no. Not for raiding. And they've also stopped wearing their shukas for raiding. The shuka is the red cloth. I didn't talk about that. But they don't wear those for raiding because now because their enemies have started using them too. And when the raiding, raiding in northern Kenya is not like an American Western. It's not that kind. It's rustling, but it's not done on horseback. It's not on foot. So you have to run. You have to run with the stampeding cows, and you've got to be able to do that for several hours. So having easy, loose clothes and having lightweight weapons. That was another thing about the heavy spear that didn't work. Having a lightweight spear is much better for that raiding.
So did the spear change because they moved towards raiding, or just because of the reason they presented before?
The spear changed, I think, primarily because they adopted a different style of fighting. There's always been raiding. I mean, raiding didn't just start this century. I mean, it's been probably around forever. But the use of the spear as a throwing, that's a mode of fighting, as a throwing instrument rather than a thrusting instrument. That's a different style of fighting, and they did change their style of fighting. And it made more sense to use the same type as your enemies used, But I can't explain to you why before that they didn't. I have no idea.